Okay.
Mm.
Should be about live on YouTube.
Sounds good.
Yep, we're up on YouTube. Joe, do you want to take us live on Zoom? Start letting folks in.
Yep, I was waiting for one.
We'll give them a few extra seconds to get here. Okay, so we are live on Zoom also. So Brian, if you want to go ahead and do a little mini owl vocalization exposition, that'd be great.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I trust everyone is watching me. I'd like to be seeing you too as well. So I'm going to imitate a flammulated owl, okay? But in your homes, your office, wherever you happen to be, I'm also going to teach you to hoot like a flammulated owl, okay? So you have to promise me that you're actually working on it at your end. So first, I'll give you a few hoots as an imitation, okay? So recognize this is a, as I'll talk more about in a moment, very small forest owl. And the pine forest in which it calls, it has a very quiet call. So what I'm going to do right now is probably going to be, you know, totally realistic for what you would hear in an open forest, except the call doesn't carry very far. All right. All right. So here's a male territorial call. It's about that pitch. It's about that frequency. Okay. And it may, you know, a male may give that, that sequence for, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 seconds during an optimal time during incubation. Sometimes it'll go for a half hour or an hour. It's anybody's guess, but. All right, so that's the standard territorial call. So the male is going to give that when he's defending territories, when he's attracting females, generally in Colorado from last part of May to the end of June or so, okay? So when the male is really upset, he's going to give a 3-note call. We call that a territory encounter call, and because it often happens in territory boundaries. And that call sounds something like this. All right, so territorial call, territory encounter call. When the male and female are around the nest, they will typically give anywhere from 2 notes to 4 notes. It's even much quieter than what I just gave you for those calls. I'll give you the male version. I can't imitate the female vocalizations. They're too high, but the male call around the nest communicating with the female will be something like sometimes. Okay. All right. So you heard a few. I'm going to take you back to the territorial call. It's your turn now. I'm going to teach you what to do with your mouth, okay, to imitate a flam call. All right. So your lips are going to form the word boop, B-O-O-P. Okay, but you're not going to sound the consonants. All right. You know, if you were talking like a human, the word would come out. All right, but these owls are ventriloquistic. They have a capability of throwing that sound, but they also have the capability of making it very hollow sounding. All right. And I'm sure this is a defense against predation. Okay. So to make it hollow sounding, what I do and what I teach my students to do is open your throat as far as you can. And instead of having the air come straight through your teeth, as you know we do when we talk, you try to direct that air up to the top of the mouth, up to the top of the palate. So it's going to reverberate around your mouth a little bit before it comes out, okay? So I'll go from human to owl, okay? In the imitation, it would go something like, all right, you're doing this at home, right? Now, hopefully you can hear the difference, you know, over YouTube and everything, right? The human hoot, the owl version. Everybody hears that, hopefully, and here's the difference, okay? So your homework is going to be imitating that. And I don't know how to check you, but maybe Carla can check in on you. So if you do that, and you know, if you practice that religiously for about 2-ish weeks, okay? This is the assignment I give my students at the beginning of the field season, for them to, you know, work on it, or maybe in the semester when I can first see them, start working on the imitations, because it takes a little while to start getting it more refined. Generally, after a couple of weeks of a lot of practice, you can start to fool a male flammulated owl, okay? And that's a head trip, because once you get a male in the field, once you get a male flammulated owl to imitate you or to respond to you, man, it's you know, you start to feel like you're growing wings, and you maybe should start climbing trees. It's a really cool thing. And certainly, you know, the students that I have that refine that well enough to do that are quite excited for the rest of the season as well. So work on that, okay? All right, that's flammulated owl calling 101.
I will check our staff in a few weeks, because part of the job description at the Owl Center, actually written in the job description, is they have to be able to imitate owl calls, because it's something every day as educators, because people hear owls. Well, what is it? You know, they heard one. What is it? I don't know. What did it sound like? They can't remember. But then if you can roll through a bunch of different owl calls, then they can say, oh, it was that one. Now, we probably don't get too many people coming that have heard a flammulated owl call.
Probably not.
But we got to have our staff ready for when that happens.
Well, they should be, no question about it.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's some, you know, there are different pitches of male flammulated owls. So it's not as if you have to sound exactly like what I gave it to you as, but it does need to sound hollow, does need to have the right cadence and the pace, and not too loud. So practice away.
Okay. So I think we should have had time for most of the folks to get here. So welcome to everybody, and especially the people who are new to this series. This is our second to the last presentation of our Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series. And just a little bit about us, if you haven't been with us before, the International Owl Center is actually located in a town of less than 1,000 people, Houston, Minnesota, way down in the southeast corner. And we didn't decide to be here, we kind of evolved here. And with COVID shutting things down, we had to look at a different method to do our education, because we couldn't physically gather together. And this has been one of the fantastic things that's come out of it, because there are so many magnificent owl people in the world that love to talk about owls and share what they know. So we put it together as the speaker series, and it's just been fantastic learning from people all over the world. Next weekend is going to be our last one, and we chose next weekend to be the last one because that's when we would normally host our International Festival of Owls, which is normally our biggest event of the year. Obviously, we can't have it in any normal way this year. There's only a few little things going on. But Professor Alexander Roulin from Switzerland will be our final virtual owl expert speaker because he is being inducted into the World Owl Hall of Fame as the Champion of Owls award winner this year, which would normally happen at the festival. So that's why we're finishing off next weekend with him as a speaker. There are a few other things you can do online. If you're on our email list, you'll find out about these also. But one thing, we do have an online store. And we're going to be giving free shipping to all orders $25 and more next weekend. And we have some special brand new items that are going to come out, including the Children's International Owl Art made into a set of 20 greeting cards. So those are wildly popular, and we're in the process right now of picking which art pieces are going to be on those cards. A little bit about how this runs. If you haven't been here before, chat is disabled in Zoom. So if you have questions, post those in the Q&A. If you are watching us in YouTube, the chat obviously is enabled, but please keep the chat on topic and tied to what's being talked about in this presentation. The presentation is being saved and archived for later viewing. So whatever you type in chat will be viewable by the people who watch it later. So do keep it on topic. Let's see, a little bit about, just a tiny bit about Brian, because he'll tell you a lot more about himself. Dr. Brian Linkhart is a full professor of biology at Colorado College, and he's been studying flammulated owls for 40 years in the Rocky Mountains. So this guy knows what he's talking about, and there aren't a whole lot of people that know a whole lot about flammulated owls. And I do want to give a special thank you to all of you who have registered for the speaker series. And donated to support the series, because that is what's making this happen and what's keeping it free so that it's accessible to everybody, regardless of where people live or their income levels, so that everybody can be learning from this. So a huge thank you to all of you who are supporting this series. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brian. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time.
Thanks, Carla. I appreciate the intro. I'm going to pull up the first slide here. Okay, hopefully that's filling your screen wherever you are. So yeah, as Carla indicated, this last summer was the 40th year of this owl work here in Colorado in the South Central United States. And today, so this work over the past 40 years has been and is encompassing a lot of different projects. Today, what I would like to talk to you about is primarily the migration aspects of flammulated owls. We've been able to confirm basically in the last 4 years that they are long distance migrants after it, being substantially supported in other ways for a number of years. But I want to give you some details about that and show you some of what we've been able to learn thus far about their migration, okay? So let me start by telling you more about flammulated owls, and I want to talk about how the study works with this and so forth. Flammulated owls are, if you can see my hand, they're small enough to fit between your thumb and index. They're only about 6 inches tall. One of the smallest owls in the world for sure. The smallest owl in the world is the elf owl of the American Southwest. And that owl is only about 10 grams lighter than a flammulated owl. For those of you that work in grams, a flammulated owl a male weighs about 50 grams, a female about 60 grams. Or as one of my students has put it, that's about 4.5 Oreo cookies for a male flammulated owl, okay? So not very much. And this owl is the only small owl in North America with dark eyes. So that's if you're in the right habitats, it's an easy ID at night if you can see the plumage but match it up with the dark eyes. So flammulated is from the Latin root flammula, and flammula means small flame, okay? Hopefully in the images you see on the screen here, you can see some of the patches of reddish orange plumage around the facial disc area, the scapulars on the back, and scattered on some of the other parts of the plumage as well. It's a beautiful plumage, and it is really adaptive as camouflage against the trunks of pine trees, but also some of the other species of trees in the pine forest. Fly-mulated owls are, of course, nocturnal, like most owls. And yeah, the migrational aspect, that happens to be, more unusual, at least in terms of being a regular migrant among the North American owls, the 19 species. This owl is entirely insectivorous, feeding mostly on small moths. I think you'll see that in some of the photos going forward here. And some of you might be familiar with the name Paul Bannock. He is a great photographer. He's put a few great coffee table type books out there as well. And he's come out to take a number of photographs. So you'll see him credited on a number of slides here, okay? So these small owls have been my focus so I've been at Colorado College, which is a small liberal arts college of about 2,000 students, since 2000, the year 2000. And so for the last 20 years, I've had Colorado College students that have been my primary workforce with me, and it requires a small army to do all that we do. I'll show you the study sites in a moment and so forth. I typically have anywhere from 8 to 10 students work with me in any given summer. These are all undergraduates because that's all that the college has. And these students for 10 weeks work with me during the time in which they're breeding in Colorado. And so I teach them, I mentor them in all aspects of the work that we do, which is a great deal of fun for me. And it's amazing what the students are capable of. Starting in 2001, the number of study areas that I'm able to, study fly-mulated owls on has greatly increased due to the number of students I've had involved. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about in the slides ahead will reflect the role that these students have played in my mentoring of them. But the true roots of the study actually go back to 1981, when I was a young undergrad at Colorado State University, looking forward to hopefully going to grad school, but I didn't know what it would be in. I had a little bit of experience in seeing owls, but certainly no experience in studying them. But I'd like to give you the backdrop for fly-mulated owls and what was known about them, at least in the beginning of this work, and particularly with respect to their natural history. What little was known about fly-mulated owls in the early 1980s indicated that they were associated with dry conifer forests and ponderosa pine. And so the study sites that I'll be talking about certainly are principally set in these habitats as well. The bottom of your screen, you can see on the right is the distribution of fly-mulated owls in blue, okay? Or purple, or, I guess it's blue. Primarily centered in the western United States, but extending into southern British Columbia in Canada and into central Mexico, northern Mexico for sure as well. And you see that question mark because in this publication that's been out forever, we know that fly-mulated owls are found as far as Central America, but we've never known whether or not these are migratory birds, or might include migratory populations that breed in the United States, or if they're breeders in their own right and their residents. The map on the right represents the distribution of ponderosa pine. And this pine and its close relatives are very similar to each other and extends down into Mexico as well. But what I'd like you to note is how similar the distributions are of fly-mulated owls and ponderosa pine. So very early on when the study began in the early 80s, there was this presumption between my my boss who mentored me in this work, Richard Reynolds with U.S. Forest Service, that flammulated owls might very well be associated with this pine throughout their distribution. And if anybody figured out where they migrate to, it would probably be associated with their distribution in their migration routes and stopover habitats perhaps as well. Anyway, associated with these pine forests, and here's a picture of the ponderosa pine forest here in Colorado, certainly from the breeding sites as well. These owls are secondary cavity nesters. This was known before I started the work, and they are obligate cavity nesters. They depend on woodpeckers to abandon the holes that flammulated owls may come to occupy for a nest itself. Probably a lot of us are familiar with what a secondary cavity nester is and the importance of them. For an owl like flammulated owls, these holes, these abandoned woodpecker holes are so important, the species would go extinct without them. That's how dependent they are. They cannot make these nests on their own. And yeah, I've alluded to the fact that about their migratory status. By the time this study began, it had never been confirmed, in fact, until recently, as I mentioned to you, but it had been presumed that they were neotropical migrants. By the way, a neotropical migrant is a bird from North America that migrates down to Central or South America, which is referred to as the neotropics in zoogeography. And this was presumed on the basis of their being insectivorous, some vagrants, some fall vagrants being found along the southeastern coast occasionally during migration time and fall migration. But absolutely nothing was known regarding specifics, the winter and the stopover areas associated with this. Well, on the basis of these characteristics, the US government and the Canadian government over time has listed them in various categories of official status. In the US, sensitive species by the US Forest Service, species of conservation concern by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and then by the Canadian government, species of special concern. So there has been concerns about their populations from a conservation standpoint for a long time. Well, it was on that basis that I got engaged in the work with my boss at the Forest Service. And you can see the upper right study area, Hotel Gulch. That's the one that was initiated in 1981. That's the one that's still going, that has the roots of the entire study. And you can see the other study sites and the years in which they've been added, my time at Colorado College. But over the course of these years, one or all of these sites have been the focus for trying to learn as much about the breeding ecology and especially the demography, the aspects like reproduction and survival, the aspects associated with the mating structure and trying to determine the pairing, the pairing characteristics of males and females, how long they're paired for each other, how much faithfulness they have to their partners and their sites and so forth. All of these demographic characteristics were aspects that I have taken on over the years to learn more about these owls and from their conservation standpoints. So before I get into the migration aspects per se, let me tell you a little bit about how my students and I study these owls, because this is going to be the basis by which we've captured the owls to be able to put on migration devices as well, okay? So I'll take you through a typical field season for just a moment, okay? The beginning of the field season, if the owls are arriving in Colorado around first week of May or so, students and I, when school is out, we typically start studying them and doing field work by the end of May or so. And that always involves a technique called territory mapping. Now, a lot of you I know familiar with this technique, but basically what it amounts to is trying to follow around singing individuals. The male calls that I was just imitating a while ago and that you are working on is key for this, okay? We go out at night, vocally imitate them, hopefully well enough to stimulate them into calling, and then chase them around at night, okay? And this is forested country, steep forested country. So running up mountains during the night with headlamps, carrying gear and so forth, talking on two-way radios to communicate with each other, sometimes tracking and following various males at once while we're simultaneously trying to territory map several adjacent males. Night after night through the season, as long as they're calling, we do this every year to try to determine the boundaries of their territories, okay? Marking the trees that they're singing from once they've left the tree. By the way, they won't only sing from the perimeter of their territories, they'll sing throughout the territories. But over time, you can get an idea of the outermost trees. And that map that you see in the upper right, this is a map of the territories that are mapped for all of the males in one of the particular study sites. It happens to be Hotel Gulch. So all of these polygons represent territories of various males, okay? Now I'll tell you that, cutting to the chase, a lot of these territory boundaries will remain, if not identical, very similar from one year to the next. So it's our job every year to substantiate whether or not they're the same boundaries or whether they've shifted. And the reason they can remain so constant is something I'll share with you in a moment. These males are long-lived. They show a great deal of faithfulness. They return to the territories every year. Well, our ultimate goal is finding the nests, okay? But we have to document the territories first. So that's followed by a systematic nest search. And basically what that entails is searching within the territory boundaries and identifying all of the trees, inventorying all of the trees with cavity trees, all of the trees with woodpecker holes. They might be live, they might be snags, dead trees. And we would do this. Technology has helped hugely. I can address what we did before about the year 2000, questions at the end or something. But what we use now are cavity cameras. They're cameras that are mounted on collapsible fiberglass poles that will extend up to about 50 feet or so. In other words, about 15, 16 meters, okay? So they go pretty high and they get pretty unwieldy. This is what we use for searching every single cavity in a territory until we find a nest, or if we find a nest, because there are bachelor males in the population that will defend a territory but are unlucky in attracting a female, okay? And by the way, each territory might have anywhere from 100 to 300 or 400 cavity trees, spread across the mountain. And each cavity tree may have anywhere from one cavity to, sometimes they're apartment complexes, 10 or 15, sometimes more cavities. So painstakingly, my students and I during the day are, so spot mapping is happening and territory mapping is happening at night. During the day, we're searching for nests. When do we sleep? Well, not too much of that. Anyway, during the day, we're searching these cavities one by one, hoping that we will see an image like you see on the bottom part of your screen, maybe a female that's sitting in a nest on eggs, or maybe we can see the back of her plumage or something like that. Once we find a nest, then the real goal can happen, and that is trying to capture the males and females at the nest. Given that this is a long-term study of demography, we are marking individual birds with rings or bands and tracking those individuals, hopefully through their entire lifetimes, tracking their reproduction and survival through that time. But it all starts with the individual nests. So here you can see a few pictures in various stages of this, capturing them at night with, we typically capture them at the nest. And this is a process I can describe later perhaps, but it involves a great deal of patience trying to capture a male and or female, intercepting them when they are exiting the cavity after having delivered off moths or food into the nest cavity. During the day, at least when the owlets are old enough, that's when these daytime shots come in. And that's when we climb the trees. In the picture on the far left, you can see a small body up the trunk of a quaking aspen. That's yours truly, up about 15 meters or so, actually, using climbing hooks to scale the trees to go up to the cavity. And one of the middle pictures, you can see my arm sunk to about the elbow, where my arm is reaching into the cavity to retrieve the owlets. This can only be done during the safe window of the nestling period, when the nest won't be abandoned by the female. And that's generally between days 18 and 23, right before fledging. Students are on the ground during this time of when I'm climbing the trees. I'll lower the young in a small bag on a rope, and they will process the owls on the ground, and then we will return them when we're done. But in this process, then, we are essentially tagging and marking and following the lives of all of the families through time, okay? So some of the patterns I can present for you briefly of what we've been able to learn about their reproduction and survival. Small family sizes, generally between 2 and 3 eggs in a nest. And you might see in one of the diagrams, these look like miniature ping pong balls, almost totally round, very small. They weigh on the order of 8 to 10 grams per egg, which is a huge investment on the part of a female in a clutch. Delayed age of first breeding. Some males may not start actually breeding until they are upwards of 7 years old. I'd say probably half of them by years 2 or 3, but they can extend up to 7. High survival rates. This is especially true on the part of the males. And in terms of the number of years we've had them ringed, we've had owls that have been ringed or banded for a minimum of 14 years. And if you add the delayed age of breeding, that means that they could be upwards of 20 years old or older as well. So, you know, this is a very small owl, okay, of course, right? And what you can, if you're familiar with large raptors and large birds, you know that there's often this reverse relationship between the size of a bird and characteristics like the clutch size. Usually small birds are the ones that have relatively large clutches and broods, and the larger birds have smaller ones. So these owls are very similar to a large bird, a large raptor, in many of their characteristics. And I like to say that flammulated owls are a big bird trapped in a small body, just because of the characteristics that they show associated with this. Well, this is important to know from a conservation standpoint, because the slower that a population can reproduce because of small family sizes, requiring several years before an adult starts to breed. This definitely can mean if a population, is under stress or the population has declined, that it can be a slow road to recovery, to bringing a population back with these kinds of characteristics. So, these conservation aspects are very important to me in studying the species with these kinds of characteristics. And it's also on this basis then that I became more and more interested, this was over decades, interested in their migration aspects of adding this to the ecological story from what I could understand in Colorado. So I see flammulated owls for about 2 months of their annual cycle, and everything that we've learned about them and I've shared with you has been in this condensed period. But, the question is always, what's happening the rest of the year? Of course, they're in transition. I mean, we hear them calling. We can't necessarily capture them outside of that 2-month window. But, for 6-7 months a year, they're not in Colorado. Where do they go? What do they do? Well, it was around 2009 that devices, instrumentation started getting small enough that it could be used on small birds, okay? And that's essentially what a flammulated owl is like a songbird in math. So I kept a close eye on techniques that were being used on songbirds. And about 2009, a device called a geolocator, or a light level instrument, started becoming small enough to put on these small birds and not be too heavy for them. And I jumped at it. I got enough grant money to get the first few. And I was very interested in addressing questions that I've got on the screen, especially with respect to their phenology, the timing of their departures and arrivals, winter destinations, where do they go, what habitats do they use, what do they do, what are their routes like, where do they stop over, and are there differences between the fall and the spring with how they're getting to those winter destinations. These were all aspects that were very important to know. And also this idea of connectivity. Many of you probably know of some particular bird species that are especially under conservation concern because there are very tight linkages between the individuals that on their breeding ground and where they winter and their winter destinations, and they show exclusive use of those particular areas, and they don't show much variance in that. So I was interested in learning how exclusive are these areas that Colorado owls use for, overwintering, for migration routes. And as this, this is an aspect that's still in flux, is trying to learn more from other populations of flammulated owls in the Western US to learn how strict and exclusive these routes are from different populations, Okay, so central questions. Let's get into it. So these light level loggers, also referred, that I'll start calling geolocators. You can see the devices in the middle of the screen. This is next to my Toyota truck key for the size perspective, and the harness material that we use as well. These devices fit onto the backs of owls with it's essentially a backpack harness. Okay, the only place it's safe to put them where the owls won't tear them apart or move them. And Migrate Technology Limited, a UK operation, started manufacturing these small enough in 2009. Okay, and these are about a gram in mass. So that's about the size or the weight of a small coin, about a dime's worth, actually about American dime. It's about half the weight of a dime or so. And you can see the accuracy on the screen. These devices, especially when they came out, if you didn't know anything about them, then the accuracy is of very little concern. If an animal is migrating across continents, being able to track it within, plus or minus 100 kilometers or 60 miles or whatever is pretty darn good. It's not pinpoint, but it is pretty darn good. Since 2009, we have deployed about 45-ish or so, and we've recovered, about a fourth of those or so, okay? And my students and I first published on the first recoveries of these 5 years ago now in the Journal of Field Ornithology, if you're interested in checking that out. So I'm going to speak to some of those results, but also some of the subsequent recoveries we've made as well. Well, here's something else that's cool, okay? In 2016, GPS-based loggers started coming into production that were small enough to put on songbirds as well, okay? So these communicate with satellites, just like your cell phone and so forth. And by the way, they're called loggers. This is actually a key point. Both of these are called loggers because the information that we're learning from the locations where these owls are always stored in the unit of this device that's on their backpack, okay? In other words, these owls have to be recaptured so that you can download the information. These are not big birds, as much as their characteristics suggest they might be. So they can't transmit this information back up to satellites. They can't transmit it to any third location. You have to physically capture the owl, 365 days later or so to learn anything about the migration route. Okay, that's a huge if to in hopes of being able to recover a device. And that's why roughly a quarter, we feel pretty good about recovering a quarter of the light level loggers on the left part of your screen. Anyway, GPS loggers, about the same mass, and the photos I put at the top of the screen and by the dime, that's what these things look like. But the accuracy is crazy cool. It's plus or minus 10 meters. It doesn't, that's amazing. And they get better than that on large birds. But being able, these are called pinpoints, not surprisingly because of that kind of accuracy. The downfall of a GPS logger is it takes a lot of juice to communicate with a satellite and to get a fix on the location on the ground. So you can only get anywhere from 20 to 40, maybe 50 fixes through a 365-day period that can actually be stored in the device before the battery power is exhausted and the thing dies. Okay, these can be recharged, which is great. You can reuse them if you can recover them. But once they're out of juice, you're done, and you have to hope that you're going to recover that owl on the summer grounds to be able to get the device. Well, so the accuracy is key, is great. That's the advantage of the GPS loggers. The downside is that you can only get 20 to 40 fixes over the winter months. You can program them, so you can specify on what dates you want these things to be activated if they can communicate with satellites. No guarantees it will. The advantage of the geolocators is that there's no communication with satellites, and so they can actually get a fix every single day if there's enough sunlight to, they're measuring the amount of light to be able to measure the length of the day and so forth. The downside of the light loggers is the accuracy. So they both have plus and minuses. And that's why these two devices are really great to work together if you can, not putting them simultaneously on the same bird, but on different birds, to be able to learn something about migration. Okay, so here is one of the first loggers we recovered in 2010. I wanted to give you an idea of the information that was learned from it. And you can see, so in yellow or gold or whatever that is, that's the fall route. And the line that is green is the spring route, okay? So this owl left Colorado on the 21st of October, all right? And arrived on the wintering grounds in central Mexico. Guys, this is the state of Michoacan. This is south central Mexico on November 3rd, okay? So the southbound route, you see it on the screen there, was 13 days, just about 2 weeks. And you can see the tiny dots associated with the stopovers, okay? Remember, plus or minus 100 kilometers in terms of the positioning of all of these things. The big fat polygon down at the bottom that covers basically the state of Michoacan, those polygons are my attempts in GIS, geographic software, to, there's a 50% accuracy polygon, a 75% and a 90%, reflecting the number of points over the winter that can fit within these particular areas. The green polygon represents the 50% accuracy. In other words, we could be confident that about half of all of the winter locations were within that enclosed area of that green polygon, okay? And the yellow represents the 95 or so. So this is a pretty large area, and this reflects, the size of the polygons reflects, the accuracy or the not very accurateness of the light loggers. but still being able to first learn that these owls were going to southern Michoacan was amazing. Okay. So somewhere in first or second week of April, this particular male started migrating back to Colorado. I don't know exactly when. For reasons I won't go into at the moment, around the equinoxes is when these devices, you can't be very confident about their positioning because there are equal day lengths, equal night lengths, and you have to wait for about 2 weeks on either side of the equinox to start having confidence in the positions that are being recorded on the device. Anyway, so in green, you can see the trajectory back to Colorado. And on 16th of May, that's when this particular owl arrived back on his breeding territory in Colorado. Okay. Wow. When my students and I first recovered this and learned for this first owl and the first few owls, it was, you know, it was just a really cool experience of being able to learn something that nobody had been able to learn before. I wanted to call out a couple of things that evident on this as well that will show up more in a moment. In the fall, you can see that for this bird, that bird was basically in a beeline to get down to Mexico, taking only 13 days. And their yellow route reflects that they were pretty much eager to get down there as quickly as they could. They pretty much straight lined it down through the deserts of the southwestern United States, the Chihuahua Desert of Mexico, even to get down to that destination. Okay. In the spring, it was definitely more relaxed, where the owls were following actually. I don't know if you can tell on your screen or not. There are two primary mountain ranges in Mexico, north and south running. One on the west coast is called the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range. Okay, that's on the Pacific Ocean side. On the Gulf of Mexico side is the Sierra Madre Oriental. And it is those mountains that this owl and many others have followed on their way back to Colorado. Various stopping sites, stopping on in the forested country around the Rio Grande River, which forms the southern boundary of the United States between Texas and Mexico, and then back up through the southwest to Colorado. You can see where I put the red polygon just now, calling your attention to northern New Mexico. That happens to be the stopover location where not just this owl, but many others actually stayed the longest period of time of any stopover during the whole migration schedule. Barely 200 kilometers from their breeding site. When I first saw this, it was like, wait a second. This owl has gone, 2,500 kilometers, and it's waiting till it's almost back in Colorado and then stopping to, before going back to its breeding grounds and staying there for, 10 days, sometimes 2 weeks. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to come back to that. Okay. Okay, so that was one male. Over the last several years, you can see the red dots now associated with, I'm going to call them the centroids, basically the center of their wintering areas is what these red dots represent, okay? And this is an average. It's still plus or minus 100 kilometers, but it's probably pretty close to the actual location where they were spending their most time. So those 12 dots represent the geolocators of what we've been able to learn so far with this particular device, okay? In northern Mexico, you see two males that decided not to go very far. The Mexican state of Tamaulipas, which is just adjacent to the Sierra Madre Orientals, but most of the other owls have gone much farther south in Mexico. And I'm going to say more about that here in just a moment as well, okay? So let me bring in the GPS loggers now, because starting in 2016, this is when we started to use this technique. Now you can see the squiggly lines. These lines are all associated with the points that are plus or minus 10 meters. So they're pretty darn pinpoint accuracy. And the big dots, in southern Mexico, represent the wintering locations for these 8 individuals to date that I can show you the maps for where they spent the winter, okay? Now, I'll put them all together here in just a moment, but I want you to notice that the GPS location, especially the winter destinations, is nicely matching up with the not very accurate geolocator data that I was showing you just a moment as well. Also, what I want to call your attention to, towards the bottom of the screen, just last year, we had documentation of one of our individuals that wintered in Guatemala. And this is the first individual we've had that has actually wintered in Central America, okay? A number of individuals in southern Mexico, but this one has gone further yet. So I'm sure, I would expect that we can find further representation of this portion of Central America being used as we continue to put these instruments on owls as well. But that was notable, quite notable for the further south of them, okay? Okay, so with respect to winter destinations, on this map here, in green, I've shown you the centroids associated with the geolocators. Remember, they're the ones that are not as accurate. The GPS loggers, the more accurate ones, are in the hot pink, okay? And as I was, saying a moment ago, it appears that these light loggers now are, and the GPS loggers are in nice symmetry with respect to the locations in Mexico where they are documenting the winter residency of these Colorado flammulated owls that have gone down there to winter. What I want to call your attention, okay, so distance-wise, this is about 3,000 kilometers to southern Mexico, about 1,800 kilometers to the northern end of those first couple, but most of them down to the southern reaches of Mexico in the states of Michoacan, Guerrero, Puebla, and some of the other states that you see reflected there as well. So this is all in the region of what's referred to as the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. I think this is really a key feature for the migration destination of many of them, okay? So as the backdrop, I've called your attention to those 2 main north-south mountain ranges, the Sierra Madre Occidental and the Sierra Madre Oriental, the ones that Colorado owls are using as a migration route. But appears that this strongly volcanic belt in southern Mexico, which pretty much connects the east, the Occidental and the Oriental mountain ranges to the west and the east, pretty much links them together with this east and west mountain range associated with the volcanic belt. There are active volcanoes in some of this region, but what they're especially associated with are pine oak forests. And the photo that I placed on the left is basically what most of these forests in here look like, okay? So it appears that the owls are definitely associating themselves in this region of their destination over the winter with this particular forest type. I want to call your attention to, some of you might be familiar with the monarch butterfly reserve overwintering sites of monarchs, one of which is called the Sierra Chinkwa Monarch Reserve. Interestingly, folks, a year before I learned that geolocators were going to be small enough for me to put on flammulated owls, I started this itch to try to learn more about migration. And I went down to Mexico in 2008, the year before I started using geolocators, because I was, some of you might be familiar with the name of Lincoln Brower, who was especially key person for determining the monarch wintering areas in Mexico. back in the 1980s and even a bit before that. Anyway, in 2008, I received an email from one of Lincoln's one of the folks that worked with him, and they had erected mist nets on the monarch preserve to capture birds. They were interested in trying to determine what kind of predation force some of the birds were exerting on the monarchs in the monarch preserve. Okay, so they were trapping over a period of time. Well, on a couple of nights, their nets were up too late. They were up after dark because they must have had some late captures, and they accidentally captured a fly-mulated owl in it, actually more than one. And so I got an email from this field worker saying, hey, Dr. Linkhart, we know you study fly-mulated owls, thought you might be interested in knowing that we snagged a fly-mulated owl here. Well, I thought, wow, this is very cool. And so as soon as I could find a break in my teaching schedule, I went down there in January, early February in 2008 to see if I could capture fly-mulated owls down there, find them as well. Remember, this is before geolocators, okay? This is before any of the instrumentation. And so on that basis, I made contact with a Mexican ornithologist. He's been a great colleague now to have worked with over the past decade or so, whose name is Javier Salgado Ortiz at the University of Michoacan. And that's who's in the blue coat that you see in the screen here with a field employee. Anyway, he arranged for us to go down near the Butterfly Preserve and start trapping for fly-mulated owls in there in the winter. And after a few unsuccessful nights, we started capturing fly-mulated owls, okay? Which was very cool. And you can see the pine oak habitats. Well, you can't tell from our perspective, but what I want to call your attention to is the structure of these forests are very similar to what Colorado forests look like as well. And I was very interested to see that the forests that the owls were using in Mexico were similar to what the Colorado owls were using as well. Well, over the span of a couple of weeks, we started capturing, I think we captured about 14 of them over this period of time. Something struck me about these owls, though, that we were capturing. And what I was trying to discern was, are these resident fly-mulated owls or are these migrants? And by the way, I've done some additional testing over the years with stable isotopes and confirmed that these are resident owls, are not migratory, okay? But I didn't know at the time. But what I could see is that these owls were even orangier than Colorado fly-mulated owls. Even more red-orange around the head region, which you can see in some of these slides here, and a little bit lighter in mass also, okay? Well, this was interesting because, that area of Sierra Cinque happens to be very close to the areas in which we are documenting now with these instruments that fly-mulated owls are wintering in, associated with these devices of GPS and geolocator. Well, I'll come back to that a little bit here in a moment. Let me take you to some stopover information that these routes, especially with the GPS devices, have been able to allow us to discern. So I've already spoken about the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. Let's say the owls are returning from their wintering destinations to Colorado. I want to take you to what appear to be some hot spots as stopovers used by these fly-mulated owls on their way back to Colorado. And the first to call your attention to is the El Cielo Biosphere Reserve. This is a cloud forest in around the edge of the eastern edge of the state of Tamaulipas that is part of the Sierra Madre Occidental Range, where fly-mulated owls appear to be stopping for a period of a couple of days on their way back to Colorado. Not a long stopover, but this apparently is serving as a very important place. The interesting thing is, this is probably one forest type that appears to deviate from the dry forests that I found them using or found evidence of them using everywhere else. This is a wetter forest, especially relatively close to the Gulf of Mexico, but they're using it, they're taking advantage of it, okay? Further north, a few hundred more kilometers, is what's known as the Maderas del Carmen Biosphere Reserve. This is just south of the Rio Grande River. This is essentially part of the mountain range of the Sierra Madre that goes through the desert. It's very dry forest, as it will be all the way up to Colorado now, okay? And these forests have a lot of dry pine, including ponderosa pine, but some others as well. And not just the GPS mails, but a lot of stopover information from the geolocators is associated with this site as well. All the others as well, but certainly this one too. Further north, another, few hundred or, well, high 100 kilometers, hundreds of kilometers further north, in extreme southwestern US, the owls, several owls have been stopping over again in what are called the Sky Islands. Folks, if you're not familiar with this term, not that you would be if you're not from the US, these are referred to as Sky Islands because they're small, isolated mountain ranges. Sometimes they can have quite an elevational lift to them that are completely surrounded by desert, okay? And these small mountain ranges may be anywhere from, tens of kilometers wide and tens of kilometers long. So relatively small, but their habitat is definitely associated with these pine-ish forests that they're stopping over in as well, okay? Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button here. And then further north is the one site that I was telling you about just a few minutes ago, just in extreme northern New Mexico, barely 200 kilometers from the Colorado breeding sites, where the owls have stopped. This is substantiated with the GPS units as well, where they are stopping in low elevation pine forests in northern New Mexico. And, barely 200 kilometers away from Colorado. What I think is going on with this, for them to spend upwards of, from 1 week or 2 weeks prior to going back to Colorado, is that they're using this as a staging area. Their Colorado breeding site is upwards of about 3,000 to 3,500 meters high. That's what the pine forests are at in Colorado. And they are subject to very, not uncommonly at all, late season snowstorms, late winter snowstorms that can occur anywhere from early April, even into mid-May. And I think the owls, since they can't have any information until they get this far about what conditions are like in Colorado, are using this as a staging area close enough to Colorado that they can probably gain some indicators about how relatively warm and the conditions may be, especially for flying insect activity, by the time they get to Colorado. So I think there are important cues in this last stopover that are enabling the owls to determine when it's safe to return to Colorado and the breeding grounds, okay? Well, in general, the timeline I've presented for you on the screen here, the departure from Colorado about the first week of October, arriving in Mexico, first or second week of November in general, sometimes later. With a fall migration, on average, this is actually just an average, around a month time to get down to their winter destination. Some individuals, it's far fewer than that. Departing in Mexico, from Mexico, first week of April, and arriving in Colorado about the end of the first week of May or so. The spring migration you see here, at least over the sample size, has about the same mean as the fall migration. But what I should have put here is the median, because there are, what we've seen so far is that the spring migration is generally lasting longer than the fall migration, which is very different compared to most songbirds that are have a really condensed spring migration period as they're attempting to get back onto their breeding grounds. I think I'll jump over this one here at the moment and leave you with a few thoughts here as I wrap things up. I've made 2 trips to Mexico now associated with Dr. Javier Salgado Ortiz. And there's no question there are a number of conservation threats associated with these pine and oak forests on that end of things. Conversion of habitats, illegal logging, and it pretty highlights to me the importance of the bioreserves that I was speaking about, as they're not totally protected areas, but they do have a level of protection that you don't find elsewhere. That's important. But there certainly are conservation concerns on that end of the migration. In terms of the stopover habitats, I want to link this with the climate change aspect. You know, as all regions of the globe are generally becoming warmer, I think there's a concern, you know, we have a concern about all sorts of forest types increasing in elevation, trying to track the temperature range to which they've evolved. And the issue with that here in the desert southwest of the United States and Mexico is that these small sky islands, there's not a lot of play there. These small forests, these small mountain ranges don't have a lot of leeway, certainly not much area to begin with, much leeway for the pine forest to be able to increase in elevation. And what may be, you know, more likely is that over time, these forests yield to scrub vegetation, which may not be nearly as suitable for not only flammulated owls, but for other pine oak long distance migrants, songbirds that are dependent on those as well. So those are concerning and I think warranting further research to learn about them as well. Connectivity remains a focus. A student of mine, Scott Yanko, who is in the process of nearing the end of his PhD, has a strong focus on connectivity, along with some other flammulated owl researchers. And in the Western United States, and we hope to be collaborating to learn more about those as well. So I think I'll stop there, and that might be a good place to entertain and take questions here in just a moment. I want to do a shout out for a lot of important people, a lot of important students that have been part of this whole research project over years, and certainly my colleague Javier Ortiz in Mexico as well. Okay. So I think I'll stop the screen share there and open things up.
Fantastic. I can't believe that's over already. It's like, that was an hour? Wow. There was just so much, and obviously so much more that you could say also. So we have questions coming in. If you're in Zoom, type your questions in the Q&A, and Joe and I are gonna take turns asking Brian questions. Joe, do you wanna lead off?
Yeah, we have a lot of really good questions. Can you explain how location is determined from a geolocator?
Yeah, okay, I appreciate the question. Geolocators are essentially making use of the length of daylight, okay? So the little light stalk that you may have seen on your screen in one of the pictures, that is it's a device on, it's a stalk on the device that's sensitive to the amount of ambient light, outside light that it is receiving, okay? And every 2 minutes of every 24 period, it is recording on that tiny little device the light intensity that it's receiving at that particular instant, okay? When you download the data, essentially what you have is a map of being able to look at, through a 24-hour period, high light intensities, low light intensities, okay? From that, you can essentially derive latitude and longitude, because latitude is dependent on the length of the day. So if you know that the time is rising and the time that the sun sets, you've got that day length is the best indicator of latitude there is. The midday can be used to derive longitude. exactly when that midday point is and what time that is, okay? So put those two together, the latitude and longitude, you're able to derive the owl's location. This is actually not all that unusual from old-time maritime sea people, maritime people in attempting to navigate across the Atlantic or other oceans as well. So this device is facilitating a technique that's long been used by other individuals. So that explains the lack of accuracy with it. You know, by getting the latitude and longitude, it doesn't mean you have pinpoint accuracy, but obviously close enough to be a big deal when an animal or a bird is crossing the lengths of different regions of the globe.
Do the all dark eyes help the owls in some ways that differs from owls that don't have dark eyes?
Well, that's a good question to ask. And in general, I think that you know, it's probably fair to say that the darker of the eyes, the more absorption of light that's happening. So one would expect that perhaps a dark surface is absorbing more light that can be used to enhance the image of what a night animal is able to see. Now, you know, there are a number of owls that don't have totally dark eyes. So how do they see so well? Well, you don't have to have entirely black or dark eyes in order to see well, but presumably it facilitates light absorption.
A couple people are suggesting or hypothesizing, I guess, that the longer stopover right at the end is for regaining energy before they have to find a mate or protect a territory or thing. Any other thoughts about that?
You know, I'm sure that might be part of it in terms of gaining some energy before they return to Colorado. You know, conservation of energy is going to be important through the whole migration route, so they can make it from one location to the next in the route. But I think I also think that you know, that close proximity to Colorado, it plays an important place to be able to determine and essentially gain some insights into the local weather conditions. I think it all part of it, and certainly does resolve around energy storage versus the anticipation of being able to get further energy once they get there and undergo courtship.
Regarding their nest cavities, is it a specific species of woodpecker that they typically nest in the cavities, or is it multiple species?
There is a little bit of flexibility. Fly-mulated owls will primarily use cavities that are excavated by the northern flicker. And these are cavities that are about 6 centimeters in diameter, okay? Plus or minus 6 centimeters. They will use smaller holes that are excavated by some species of sapsuckers and some others as well. But the northern flicker, Colaptes is the genus, is the most common of the larger woodpeckers and one that the owl depends upon the most.
We have a lot of very good questions, so I'm going to combine a couple of them. How monogamous are they? Do they mate for life? Do they migrate individually or in groups? So like intraspecies stuff. Yeah,
I'll take that second question first. I don't know. I don't know how they might, what kind of social status or social combinations they migrate. And given that they're at night and given that it's very difficult to keep track of them at night anyway, I really don't know. I think it's probably I think they migrate singly. It's just my own impression of their behaviors and seeing them on the edges of the breeding season. But I don't know, that may be completely unbased, and there might be at least some small grouping that facilitates their movement when they do go. With all young owls, all young birds, of migratory species, they're migrating to a destination they've never been before. In the case of young flammulated owls, all evidence that we have is that they are leaving the study sites about 3 to 4 weeks before the adults do. So whether or not, the young of the year are banding together and going south, I don't know, but I would suspect that, they certainly aren't going without any guidance and flying blind, so to speak, using their own instinctual capabilities when they do go. So definitely no linkage, or at least immediately, between the young of the year and the adults, and whether or not, there might be some grouping otherwise. That'd be a great thing to learn. In terms of mate fidelity, this might disappoint some of you. They don't mate for life, okay? In fact, we're learning that a lot of birds don't, as it takes a lot of years of study to be able to determine that. And what I see in flammulated owls is this is really interesting, actually. Males have tremendous fidelity. They have a tremendous faithfulness to their breeding territories. I alluded to that. So much, though, that males will almost always return to the same territory for their entire reproductive lives, okay? That's serious faithfulness, okay? So a male will stay on that territory regardless of whether he has a female mate or not. In other words, in years in which a male might be a bachelor, who cares? Well, it's not who cares, but I've got my landscape, I've got my forest, I'm going to bide my time. If I have to go migrate again and come back and try again, by golly, that's what I'm going to do, okay? Females, okay, so, if a female leaves him or she dies or whatever, he carries on as if nothing has changed. Females, you might say, are a completely different animal, okay? They have very little fidelity to males or to the territories. And so females are quite prone to divorcing their males. And what appears from the data I've collected over time is that the pattern is females appear to be upgrading over time. When they return from migration, they will often go, and if they don't come back to the original territory, which happens about 50% of the time, okay? About 50% of the time they'll return to their old mate. But the other 50% of the time, they are going off and finding presumably greener pastures. And how far do they go? Well, usually it is 1 to 2 territories away from their original territory. And they will, go through courtship and mate and pair and mate with a neighboring male who in most cases happened to be a neighbor when they were on their original territory the year or two before, okay? So females appear to be taking advantage of social information that would be available in a previous year to make decisions about where to go subsequently and where they would go if in fact they do divorce their original mate, which happens with surprising frequency.
Wow, that is so interesting and amazing. But
It's
you get
crazy fun.
long-term data is amazing.
Yeah.
I'm going to combine a couple also pertaining to territories. So one is what is the size of the territory, and then what some of us who are into acoustics are dying to know. So how do you know what the edge of the territory is? So can you tell the difference between the territory holder's voice and the neighbor's voice? So how do you know who is who?
Yeah, great question to ask, or great questions. So average territory size is on the order of about 15 to 30 hectare. Okay, so I don't know if you call that relatively large or relatively small. It's relatively large compared to a songbird, similarly sized songbird, but it's also, not huge either. Sometimes they can be larger. They can be, upwards of 40 hectares, sometimes a little bit larger than that as well. So the way we discern territory boundaries It's especially meaningful when we are able to take advantage of territory encounters, territory boundary disputes. You remember that call, that 3-note call. When we hear that call at night, we go running as fast as we can for the male or males that are giving that call. Because when that happens, a male is having usually a close encounter with a neighboring male. And this often occurs along ridge tops. This is very steep terrain, and it appears that ridge tops often serve as the boundaries between and among territories. Anyway, when you get to that destination, and if the territory battle is still happening, what will happen is that males, adjacent males will sing from adjacent trees right on a ridgetop, okay? And they will bounce from on their respective side of a presumed boundary. They will bounce from one tree to another up and down the ridge. And you feel like you can almost see the boundary based on the respective sides of the ridgetop or elsewhere if it's not coinciding with a ridge, on the basis of the positioning of these respective males when they're calling back and forth. And when the encounter is over, when they've had enough, when they're needing to go back to feeding duties, again, this is usually during incubation, then they will generally start distancing themselves and going retreating in the direction of their nests as they do so. Along those lines, and so by the way, that my first insights into this was years ago when I was doing telemetry studies. I was placing radio transmitters on owls and following them around, so I know respective identities of owls on ridgetops and so forth. And what I also was able to watch and learn is that occasionally one of the males that would be engaging in a territory encounter call would stop calling, okay, and invade the territory of the other male. Now, vocalization always stops by a territorial male when he leaves his presumed territory boundary and starts invading into the adjacent territory. Where do those invading males go? They often, at least a good chunk of the time, they will make their way to the nest of that adjacent male, and they will hang out in the nest site observing. I think this is more social information being gained on the part of males, checking out prospective mates for the future. Females are taking advantage of this as well. This is all important from a prospecting behavior standpoint for those of you that are familiar with that. Anyway, so these invading males, when they get to these nest sites, and I should say, as soon as they leave the territory boundary, their behavior changes markedly. They look as though they are they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. I know that's anthropomorphizing, but they not only do they become really quiet, but they start flying as though they forgot how to fly. They're hitting foliage, they're hitting sticks on the trees and breaking them, especially when they get in the nest sites. The sloppy flying, and you never hear a flammulated owl fly under normal other circumstances. So all of this time, the resident male will tail the invading male, calling and calling, giving, I call them hoarse encounter calls. It's a very hoarse 3-note call that that's a sort of a poor imitation of it. Tailing that male around, there'll be tail chases around the nest site, usually not terribly physical though. And eventually after 15 to 30 minutes, the invading male will go back to across the territory boundary and almost immediately will start calling, again, giving the territorial calls once he's crossed that boundary. So there's just been a lot of observation time over the years trying to understand these behaviors and piece the pieces together. And that which I've described pretty much describes the process of these kinds of interactions. And every male eventually will do the same thing, leave his territory and become an invading male foreign male that goes into another nest site as well, okay? I used to call them, well, we still do if I don't know their identity. I call them UFOs, unidentified flammulated owls, because unless they're marked, you don't know exactly which territory they belong to. But when I've had them marked, you know, I can say, oh man, that's A40 male, he's doing it again.
So then to tie with that, can you identify each individual male by voice?
Sometimes, but not always. It usually requires that the song is somewhat unique, in a relatively higher or lower pitch. Sometimes the pitch is so high that, you know, we'll call it call the male Victor Victoria or some such term, you know, indicating that maybe he sounds like a female's voice. So it has to be pretty unique for us to tell the difference. Otherwise, most males sound similar enough to my ears and most of the rest of us that we can't tell the difference.
That's fascinating. Several people have asked about forest fires being a factor in flammulated owl population decline.
Well, that's a great question to ask, and it's something I'm very interested in. Many of us are probably familiar with, you know, the idea of megafires, that fires are becoming larger, especially in arid environments, but perhaps elsewhere as well. Fires are becoming larger, but also becoming hotter. Ponderosa pine, the forest that I've been speaking about, is, you know, Ponderosa pine happens to be the most widely distributed conifer in North America. So it's got a really large distribution. And in the Southwest and West US, it has, you know, it of course engages in fire and has historically in the evolution of the species for, you know, tens of thousands of years. And there's pretty good evidence to suggest that these forests evolved not only, but principally with low intensity ground fires that would burn small areas historically from lightning strikes. And these small burns would stay relatively on the ground where they would not get very hot, but they would kill young trees and help to maintain open forests. And they developed, you can actually see the tree behind me that's owl is nesting in. This is a ponderosa pine tree. Look how thick the bark is on either side of the lightning strike scar that you can see on your screen. It's easily, you know, 5-ish centimeters, maybe 6 centimeters wide on either side of the trunk. Now, granted, this is due to a scar, it's a scar associated with trauma, but the bark is still extremely thick and can be thicker than that as well. That's one of their adaptations to fire. But more recent mega fires are burning hotter. There have been several fires in Colorado that have consumed large areas. I've got one of my study sites. Some of you may have noticed the name, the Hayman Fire. I started that burn area as one of my study sites after the Hayman burned in 2002, trying to look at the rate of recolonization by flammulated owls into that large, expansive area that burned, to see if the owls would return to the low burn or no burn patches of islands within the greater burn area. Incidentally, just this summer, we had 3 megafires that occurred in Colorado, each of which, the Hayman had been the state's largest fire in Colorado's history. The one that I was just speaking to. This summer, we had 3 new fires, each of which totally surpassed the Hayman in size and almost doubled the size of the Hayman, which was already a mega fire. So they're happening throughout the West. And the dangerous thing about them is a lot of those burns are crown fires. There's been enough fuel that's layered up over the decades due to fire suppression you know, putting fires out all of the time over the previous century, that fuel layers have built up, allowing the fires to jump from the ground where they burn historically up into the trees. And there's no tree species including ponderosa pine that can survive that. So these crown fires can take out just about everything. So the long and short of it, sorry, coming back to the question, is that you know, I feel strongly that not only for fly-mulated owls, but fly-mulated owls perhaps as an indicator, reflect the fact that, you know, these expansive areas of what were suitable habitat for them are being taken out by these megafires. And it may very well be, you know, centuries, 100 to 200 years before those forests return in those areas. I mean, almost 20 years after the Hayman burn, there are still huge swaths of area that aren't even regenerating yet with any trees at all. And, you know, these trees on these sites, I've got, you know, in my study sites where I'm studying the owls and where the owls are nesting, they're regularly using trees for foraging that are from 200 to 400 years old, plus years old. And so, of course, it's going to take centuries for the forest to recover and become mature again for owls and other species that depend on these forests to recolonize. So I think there are some huge consequences associated with these mega fires, and we need to, you know, find some way of and you know, doing some manipulative tree removals to reducing the fire hazards in such areas are going to help in the future, but we've got to be making progress on that front.
Do neonicotinoids, get all those syllables in there, contribute to the decline of the owls via the decline of the insects they consume, or are their habitats too remote for the neonics to be a problem?
Good question to ask. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know what role it may play, if at all. You know, I'm sure that, you know, there are pesticides that are showing up in, you know, several of these moths of the family Noctuidae are migratory. These moths will move from lower elevations to higher elevations, and they probably are picking up at various places on the landscape these toxins and perhaps others. The extent to which it is affecting their numbers, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows, because especially for nocturnal insects, I mean, that's even more problematic to figure out than diurnal insects. So that's unfortunately a tough one to wrap one's head around.
Another question about diet that may be difficult to answer. A lot of people are asking about diet. What are the primary insects that they eat? What is their interaction with monarchs? And if they're primarily insectivores, what else do they eat if they can't find any insects?
Yeah, well, they are insectivorous, and they feed mostly on small moths. And these moths are generally of the wingspan or the size about what I'm showing you here. Some of you might be familiar with the so-called miller moths that fly around, you know, lamps or street lights at night and so forth. The family Noctuidae is one of the principal families and is definitely the most speciose family of all moths. So that's an important one. There's another family called Geometridae. These are two very important families, by the way. They are actually able to, you know, around the beginning of the breeding season, there are a lot of nights where the temperature is below freezing, below the freezing point. And these are the only two families of moths that have the capability of thermoregulating and remaining active below freezing, okay? To probably -3 or 4 C, they can remain pretty active. So I think they're really, really important in supporting and feeding owls when they start courtship after they return from migration. So the moths are, from everything I can tell and the data I see and so forth, they are constituting probably 80 to 90% of their diet in the first month of the breeding season. Around the nestling period, midsummer, it broadens, the diet broadens a lot. Taxonomic groups represented can include orthopterans, crickets, grasshoppers, and the like, coleopterans, beetles, and some others. So the diet broadens, but it's still principally moths that they are primarily capturing in the tree crowns, okay? They're gleaning, and I can say more about that if somebody's wondering. Males will fly into tree crowns and they'll glean them from their resting places on the tree foliage. So the study has gone on long enough now that I've been able to document some severe droughts that have occurred. Incidentally, all of them have occurred since the year 2000. We've been under a lot of drought conditions here in the Southwest and West. Not sure we're out of them. And, given the forecast going forward, we probably will be seeing more. In any event, on occasion, we have seen small vertebrate prey show up in the nests. This doesn't happen very often, and the only documentation I have for it is in these drought years, when apparently the insect abundance is so low that they are having to do anything to find something that they can eat. And they will take, I've seen them take, under these circumstances, very small field mice, Peromyscus, the genus Peromyscus, and bring them back to the nest. They're not very efficient at doing much with them. So the male's the primary forager. On the occasions in which I have seen him bring them back to the female in the nest, sometimes the mouse will stay. I'll climb the tree later or use the cavity cameras to check on the status. And sometimes the mouse that's delivered will just stay in the bottom and not get eaten. And these owls are not very powerful. The talons are not very powerful, or the beak. And you can see some attempts, where the skin looks disheveled and maybe a skin tear on such individuals of the Peromyscus, but they don't get eaten. There are other circumstances that eventually will get eaten. So under extreme occasions, they will, facultatively take some vertebrate prey, but it's only under very unusual circumstances when I've seen it at all.
And then a couple people were asking about eating monarchs. Aren't they toxic?
Oh, yeah, they are. So I don't think flammulated owls will take them. I don't know that unequivocally. I can't address it in that way. But I think the only reason that flammulated owls were caught in some of those mist nets around the Sierra Cinque Butterfly Preserve is that the forest type that the butterflies are in, which are called oyamel, it's a high elevation fir forest, is immediately elevationally above the pine fir forest, which are just slightly lower on the mountain. And I think there were some flammulated owls that were primarily in the pine fir that may have been high enough elevationally to get stuck in the nets. I'd be surprised if they might be attempting to take monarchs. I could be wrong. Incidentally, I did trap for, probably a total of a 2-week period in these oyamel forests trying to see if flammulated owls were occupying them. We never heard any flammulated owls in this monarch habitat and never trapped any flammulated owls in that either.
So this question is from somebody who works for the Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest. So he studied spotted owls and flammulated owls, and found the flammulated owls in northwestern California are highly responsive to the northern spotted owl calls. And he's wondering if they're responsive to other owl calls in your area.
It happens on occasion. I certainly mimic some spotted owl calls. I'll mimic other owls out at night as well, just, to see if anybody might respond. Flams will, I've had flammulated owls that have responded to spotted owl calls before. And probably out in the Pacific Northwest, you have a lot more opportunity to be able to see, to what extent that happens. Great horned owls are probably the most abundant large owl in these forests where I do my work. And horned owls will definitely be potential predators of them. I've had horned owls that have come after singing owls. doing playbacks around mist nets, playing back flam calls in order to try to capture flammulated owls, has drawn in great horned owls before. And whenever I've heard horned owls call, even either around such structures or just on their own, flammulated owls will usually go quiet. So maybe that's a different response than what they would show with spotted owls, or especially with respect to the experience that this individual has in the Northwest. I can't say.
And that kind of leans into another question. What are the predators of flammulated owls?
So the adults have few predators, okay? Larger raptors, the horned owls will certainly be part of that. We've got northern saw-whets, we've got northern pygmies that are in these study sites as well. The saw-whets, I've seen them do tail. On occasion, I've seen some relatively close nest sites between these different species. Never have lost any flammulated owls. I've seen some tail chases from adult saw-whets that have chased male flams. Maybe it was too close to the saw-whet nest or something, but never have seen any direct predation on them. It appears that adult predation is very unusual, very, very unusual. I'm sure it happens, and I'm just not in the right place at the right time over all these years even. But two other organisms to tell you about. By far, the most important predator of flammulated owls are predators of the nests and of the eggs. And those would be red squirrels, Hudsonicus, Tamiasciaris hudsonicus is the species. This is a relatively small squirrel. I mean, the body is only about so long, and those that you may be familiar with it in, all conifer forests throughout North America for sure. And these squirrels, who feed primarily on seeds of cones, conifer cones, and will build these large middens on the landscape where they will extract the seeds and store cones and so forth. During the flam breeding season, they will facultatively raid the nests of flammulated owls in tree cavities and other cavity nesting birds, but flammulated owls for sure. And I think this is actually, so in some years, I think this is climate driven actually. This is a native species, but I think climate change is impacting this picture. In relatively normal precip, when cone production is relatively normal, sometimes we won't see any nest predation in the season at all. And that's from a sample size of 25 to 40 flammulated owl nests that we might find in a season, okay? In other years, especially in dry years, there's been a tendency to see high rates of predation by these red squirrels. And sometimes it can be 50 to 75 or 80% of the nests succumb to predation. I can't always nail who the nest predator is, of course, but the smoking gun always seems to reflect the work that red squirrels will do. We'll find a cracked eggshell on the ground. It looks like the margins are done by the incisors of a squirrel. I've seen them carry them off. I've seen them carry off small flammulated owl nestlings as well. So I think they're the greatest threat, and I think climate change is contributing to that. That's actually one of the greatest concerns I have on the breeding grounds associated with climate change at the moment. I think black bears, interestingly, are an occasional predator as well. Black bears will climb trees with cavities, and especially if the tree happens to be a quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides. Black bears, I mean, you can see this all around the landscape where you can see the claw marks of trees, and you can find a high incidence of cavities that black bears will actually tear off the side of the tree on. And gang, these cavities can be 30 to, sorry, I'll put it in meters, anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 meters off the ground. And these black bear will climb up there, holding onto the tree. They'll use their upper canines to stick them in the cavity, and start ripping open the cavity until it's large enough that they can stick their head in so that they can eat the contents. I've not lost a flammulated owl nest to black bear so far. So I don't think it happens very often. And that's against a sample size now of probably about, I don't know, probably upwards of 650, 700 flammulated owl nests I've found over the years. But I'm sure it occasionally happens. But woodpeckers for sure, the black bears take their share of them. And I think, you know, the woodpecker young can often be begging at night in the forest, giving their begging calls. And I think that's one of the cues that black bears wandering through the forest at night are able to key in on. So that's what I know about the predation picture. Oh, sorry, I can add a little bit more than that. I told you about predation on adults, not much, and on the nests. The other factor happens to be fledglings. Flammulated owls, like most birds, fly very poorly when they fledge. And flammulated owls, of course, have never flown before the night that they fledge. They've never been out of the cavity. They don't tree themselves like a larger owl would do and stay around them. Once they fledge, they're gone. They're done with the nest site. And so on their maiden flight, their wings are so underdeveloped, the muscles, that they will usually do a 45-degree flapping bomb down into the ground, okay? And usually it's just duff pine needles in the ground so they'll bounce and they'll be fine. They'll run to the nearest tree and start climbing. I have radio tagged a number of family units over the years. Not a lot, I should say. It hasn't been that many, upwards of about 15. And I have noted predation on fledglings, and usually they have been accipiter hawks, a goshawk, take a couple of Accipiter gentilis, take a couple of owlets of one brood, usually Accipiter striatus, the sharp-shinned hawk, or Cooper's hawk, Cooper eye, will take some occasionally as well. Those sharp-arbed predators will easily see flammulated owl young that are roosting during the day, because these young are not very smart at it. When they're roosting during the day out in the open, they'll usually roost up against the side of a tree trunk, and you know they might might start preening during the day. They might actually start vocalizing all sorts of inappropriate behavior, and these accipiter don't need any help. I also had once a puma, a mountain lion, a catamount, take a flammulated owl. And the way I figured that out, well, I'm putting some pieces together, but I found the mangled transmitter of one of my flammulated owl fledglings inside the hole in the ground that was occupied by, turned out to be mountain lion. So I'm not sure exactly how that happened. It must have happened one of the few nights after, shortly after fledging, and maybe an owlet was roosting close to the ground, and a mountain lion fortuitously saw it. So ground predators and mammals will occasionally take some, I'm sure, but it's usually avian predators that will take flammulated owls and usually the fledglings.
Can you talk a little bit about the redder versions that you found in Mexico? A couple people are asking about, is it like a genetic morph like they have with screech owls, or is it more of a individual thing, or?
You know, I think it is. I think it's associated with the oak component of the stands, of the pine stands, the pine oak stands, and some of the other conifer elements that might be part of that as well. Probably genetic. You know, we don't see that kind of that color morphs as distinct as you might with, say, the otis or the megascops associated with the screech owls, because, you know, those are residents, and you can definitely get more differentiation among the genetics, the gene pool of resident populations than one that is long distance migrant and probably mixing a lot more genes with associated populations. But, you know, you can still see it. You can still see the reddishness, and that was my first clue that probably these were resident flammulated owls that we were first capturing in Mexico.
I'm going to combine a few questions about extra pair copulations. So have you found extra pair copulations by females and a male have multiple females and mates in the same year? How does that all go?
Yes, good, excellent question to ask. So if you comb the literature, you might see that Richard Reynolds and I published a small note. Holy cow, that must have been 1987-ish or something like that. The first documented or first known to us documented copulation among owls, Strigiformes, that we were aware of and can find any evidence of in the literature, okay? So that was the first one that we fortuitously happened to see. But over the years, I've certainly documented other extra pair copulations, and not a ton because you have to be at the right place at the right time. I expect probably I've seen over the years only 10 to 15 perhaps, where I've been able to at least say, oh, well, that definitely wasn't the resident male, right? I think, let me complete that. So what I've been doing for the last several years is collecting blood samples from every, from all owl families that I can capture and the young that I can get blood from as well. So I'm in the process of doing the genetic work, or hoping to get the genetic work done so that we can go from documenting extra pair copulations to extra pair fertilizations, which I cannot say that has occurred yet. To some extent, I think it is happening, but whether the fertilization is happening is going to require that genetic work. Okay. But it is out there, it is happening, and I think maybe I'll say one more thing. So in any given year, there is generally a bachelor population of about 30 to 50% of the males in a study area may be bachelor males, unpaired, okay? So what I'm wondering is if that might be one of the strategies that these bachelor males are employing, is that they are, sneaking into paired territories on occasion and copulating with the resident female. Hope to, learn more about that in the next couple of years.
So then the other part was, have you documented a male having multiple females at the same time?
Okay. So the short answer to that is once, okay? And that happened in 2008, and it actually happened to occur in the Hayman fire, the Hayman burn area. Again, this is actually a small note that's published. I think it was 2008, for anybody that might be interested. The first documented polygyny in the species. And this is actually, I can tell you a couple of aspects about this. This is really interesting. Starting with the night that we happened to document it. My students and I were in the Hayman burn area. We were all separated from each other. We had found 2 nests that we were documenting, and I had 2 pairs of students at either of these nests that were about 500 meters apart to try to capture the adults, okay? I was off looking for another nest, but I was within radio chatter. And early in the evening, I heard one of my students say, "We just caught the male. He was unbanded, so we banded him and just released him. So now we're going to start waiting to see if we're going to wait a while and go back in to see if we can get the female." It was during the safe time of the breeding season for trying to attempt both of the night. At the other nest, I was checking with the other team, asking, "Have you guys seen, how are you guys doing? Are you capturing him?" "Brian, we have not even seen the male at this nest." This is 500 meters away, right? Well, after the first team captured the male, it was about an hour later that the team associated with the quiet nest saw the male come into a nest site for the first time. And they got in touch with him. "Brian, we just saw the male. We're going to get in capture position, see if we can snag him." Long story short, they happened to capture him. But what happened next was really interesting. And they called me. Every team has a hard copy of the banding record of all of the bands, and we update that daily and so forth. Brian, we just captured a male, and it's a shiny band. It's an aluminum band, you know, and it's a shiny band. The number is not showing up on our banding sheet. And I said, well, Julia, what's the number on it? It's 1593, and she gave me the rest of the sequence. And then, you know, in the back of my mind, I was remembering the band number that the first team had captured. But it wasn't just me. There was total silence on the radio waves for about 10 seconds, and then somebody got on the line, and it was a person from the first nest that captured the owl. Brian, that's the band number of the male we just captured. And then it's total quiet again for 10 or 12 seconds. Everybody's wheels are spinning, and somebody else got in. No, that's not possible, you know. And then this discourse started happening, and it turned out to be the very same male who was two-timing, had two different females. And over the series of nights in the coming weeks, we were able to, you know, document the whole thing. And what I was especially interested in is so the primary nest is referring to the nest that the male started with, and it usually has a timeline that is, you know, a little bit ahead of the secondary nest female. So the secondary nest was having real problems. The young were losing weight. There were 3 young in there. 2 of them died to starvation. I had never seen that happen before. I have since seen it with some of the droughts we've been in, but I had never seen that before. The primary nest, all the young successfully fledged at full weight at for what they should have weighed. As it turned out, the secondary nest only fledged 1 young, and the last couple of weeks, the male had not made any prey deliveries, and it was the female who had, you know, during our observation time, the only one making prey deliveries. He fledged about 20% under mass, as I recall. Maybe it was even a little bit more than that. Full feather lengths, because we typically measure feathers on him and so forth. But the long and short of it is there appeared to be a high cost, especially to the secondary female, of pairing with the male that was already, you know, paired and having another nest. And so, you know, facultative polygyny, I think as we demonstrated, probably happens rarely. It's the only time I've ever found it in the, you know, all of these nest attempts over the years. And I think in this case, it was probably associated with a Hayman burn. Because of the burn area, there were very few males around that had taken advantage of the small islands of surviving forest. And the female was making the best of a bad situation and pairing with the male. You know, maybe she had no knowledge of it anyway, being 500 meters apart at the time she initiated it anyway. So it was a great cost, and probably evolutionarily that's been, you know, that's probably a substantiation for why we don't see it more frequently in fly-mulated owls. How's that for a short answer?
Combining a couple other questions, you seem to be focusing mostly on the males. Is there a higher survival rate in males than females? And kind of a similar question, what do the females sound like?
So I'll start with that last one first. I can't imitate the female vocalizations very well. I'll give a really poor attempt. It sounds a little bit like a cat mew, a kitten mew, okay? And it goes something like, mew, mew. But it's much quieter than that and much better than that, okay? That's really bad. You know, at least in terms of putting on GPS devices and geolocator devices, yes, they have only been put on males for a couple of reasons. One, so I already told you that females have a high likelihood, a much higher divorce rate, much lower rates of fidelity, much higher likelihood that we will never see a female again after she breeds on the study area. So I still have not been able to get to the bottom of this. I think females have lower survival rates, but I need to clarify substantiation of that for sure. But it seems like from multiple indicators that's the case. For example, we have bachelor males in the population that cannot pair every year. The other part of that is due to the low fidelity of females and possibly lower survivor rate, I've been reluctant to put devices on females in the populations I study anyway, because I don't want to contribute to lowering what could be a lower survival rate, but there's already a lower likelihood of recovering the instrument just based on the lower fidelity of females. So I've opted to go with the sex, at least in these initial years, that are likely to have the greatest payoff from being able to recover and download the data.
And that seems like a pretty snap decision to make. How do you tell a male from a female?
Around the nest site, usually with just a little bit of observation, we can pretty clearly tell the behavioral roles from each other. And if we can hear vocalizations, no problem at all. If we happen to have capture, so most of the captures are happening at the nest sites, okay? Not all of them. Some of them happen in mist nets that are not associated with nesting areas and with playbacks and after fledging has happened. So we may not, know the identity of the individuals we've captured, especially if they're unbanded, of course. So if the only way that we will be able to distinguish on the site and be able to sex with a relatively high degree of accuracy is, we cannot unequivocally, but we'll look for an incubation patch, a brood patch on the part of females. If it's a female that failed her nest early in the season, she may very well be, refeathering her breast. And sometimes you can't tell, but usually you can still see the indication of the incubation patch. Mass differences help, but the reversed sexual size dimorphism is not great and it's not strongly indicative of the sex in these species. Males about 50 grams, females about 60 grams, but there can be overlap, so that's not real helpful. Sometimes the individuals, the males, will vocalize in hand. And if it's a male that's captured in a net, and is being territorial in hand, well, then we know. But in most cases, we will, and we take blood from everybody. We'll take a drop of blood and we'll do DNA sexing to determine after the fact the sex of individuals that we can't tell.
Okay, we're at 2 hours. That time just flew, and we didn't even scratch the surface of the questions. There's still 31 that we didn't get to yet. There was, so many awesome questions, and I want to know the answers to all of them too, but.
Sorry for the long responses. Maybe I contributed to that too.
They were fantastic. The detail is also.
Well, there has been a lot going on in this study over the years, and there are a lot of backstories, unfortunately, that feed into some of the questions. So hopefully that's helped too.
Yeah. So if we can have our staff and chat room moderators post the link to your website, I assume that has links to or at least citations for your published papers also on your website at Colorado College.
Yes, it's not up to date though, so I can work on that for you.
Okay. And then also, we do have a link where you can contribute to this research also. It's fantastic research. It's engaging students at a really serious level, undergrads. So, I think that's absolutely amazing. So there, our moderators are going to be posting links and instructions for that also, because you do need to specify that it is for the OWL project at Colorado College when you make the donation there. Brian, thank you a ton for sharing your information with us. I wish this could have been twice as long because
it's been a pleasure. I thank you for the opportunity.
You have such a depth of knowledge that it's fantastic and intimate knowledge. And thank you also to everybody who's donating to support this series. That's what's making this tick. That's what's keeping it free. So more and more people everywhere on the planet can enjoy this. This one will be saved to our YouTube channel. So if there was something you missed or you want to review or somebody didn't see it, you can go to the International Owl Center's YouTube channel and watch it later. Next week is our last presentation. So those of you who have been here every Sunday afternoon for 3 months are, we're all going to go through withdrawal after this, right? So the last speaker is going to be Dr. Alexander Roulin from Switzerland, who's been studying barn owls for, I think, about 35 years over there, very in-depth, all different kinds of things. And that speaker also will be sponsored by all of you who are donating to support this series. We don't have a specific sponsor for it. And it's wrapping up because next weekend is theoretically our International Festival of Owls weekend. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, there's not much going on this year, but festivalofowls.com has what we normally do and what we're doing this year on it. And if you're interested and aren't already, if you go to the International Owl Center website, internationalowlcenter.org, you can sign up for our e-newsletter. So that'll keep you up on what's going on with us and future speakers also. This has been successful enough. Even though COVID hopefully is not still going to be raging next winter, we are still hoping to continue this in a smaller way in future winters because it's been awesome. So thank you all for being a part of this. Brian, thank you again so much for sharing your incredible knowledge with us. And I assume there's a whole bunch of people that still want to talk to you.
Carla, Joe, and Andy, thanks for hosting this. Appreciate all you've done for it.
Thank you much. See everybody next week.